would later happen to Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Black Panther Party, Angela Davis, and other freedom fighters. And so the talk by Ajamu Baraka on human rights is relevant today because we still are not living in a situation of peace, justice, freedom, and equality that we should be living. And so, again, on behalf of Wayne State University and the Department of African American Studies, I want us to put it together to welcome Ajamu Baraka.
Thank you. It is really an honor and a pleasure to be here this afternoon, back here in Detroit. I was here just about a month ago.
Yeah, that's
It kind of feels like about a year ago, but that's all right. Thank you for the newly formed Green Chapter here at Wayne State. Thank you for everyone involved in organizing this event this afternoon. As advertised, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about human rights. It's going to be, I guess, bifurcated because I'm going to then go right into the conversation around how we address some of the human rights issues that we will surface. And we believe that in the Stein Baraka campaign, we have some answers to how we address some of these ongoing human rights issues. And I guess that's really the first part that I want to share with you, that we in fact have human rights issues here in this country. We are in fact facing an ongoing human rights crisis.
Sir.
But in attempting to address that crisis, we are not going to be able to address it in the sort of normal or standard way in which we address human rights here in the country and within the sort of understanding of how human rights work. So let me explain what I mean by that. Many of you are familiar with the writings of Malcolm X, who counseled the emerging Black liberation movement in the early 1960s to consider embracing a human rights framework. He made the argument that it was limited to just look at the issues in the U.S. From a civil rights perspective. He said it was important for the Black liberation movement and indeed for the movement that people were involved in and struggling against oppression to consider the applicability of the human rights framework. Of course, this was a time in history where there were many peoples and nations in motion who were involved in struggling for liberation, struggling for a new vision of their society and indeed a new vision of the world. And Malcolm said that we as a Black liberation movement needed to be connected to that global struggle, that the struggle for social justice in the United States, the struggle for self-determination was in fact a global struggle that had international implications, so we needed to link up to that. Now, the basis of that, though, we want to go back for a moment and establish the basis of what some people might define as sort of a radical approach to resistance and a radical understanding of the applicability of human rights. And to do that, I want to back up very briefly to the period that really influenced Malcolm and really established what we call the radical conception of human rights, and that is 1945. We all remember that 1945 was a very important year. That was the end of the Second World War, the war that some of us refer to as the Second Imperialist War.
Yes.
That was the end of that conflict and the beginning of putting in place structures and institutions that would govern international relations for the globe, for the period going forward. One of the most important of those structures was, of course, the United Nations. In 1945, that process of developing the United Nations was sort of finalized in San Francisco. Now, with the United Nations being put in place, and with one of the major planks of the United Nations being a commitment to human rights, there were many in the African American community that saw that as a strategic opportunity. That here you have this new structure, this new institution that said that it was committed to peace and to human rights, lifting up the human dignity of all people. So there was a very intense conversation, struggle among African American people in the U.S. around how to relate to the UN. And it became even more intense when it became clear that what the UN had to do, it had to define what it meant by human rights. And that responsibility was given to the Human Rights Commission. That commission was established in 1946, and its responsibility was to, in fact, define what human rights were supposed to be, how human rights were supposed to govern how states related to their own citizens. So this was seen as an opportunity to take the struggle of black people in the U.S. beyond the borders of the U.S. It was seen also, too, as a place in which linking the struggles of black people in the U.S. with the anti-colonial struggles was very important. Because as many of you might know, there's always been a very strong internationalist thrust of the Black Liberation Movement in the United States. The Black Liberation Movement was never only concerned with the United States. It was not only connected up with struggling people around the world, but of course struggling people who were of African descent around the world. So the issue of ongoing colonialism was a major factor, a major element that many people in this country felt we had to address. So they saw this new space as a contested space, a space in which they could raise up the issue of ongoing racial discrimination in the U.S. and ongoing colonialism in the world, in particular in Africa. So in 1946, when the Human Rights Commission came together to begin to put in place the human rights framework, if you will, there was a very important petition that was submitted by the National Negro Congress. This was a petition that said basically that there's a human rights crisis in the U.S., and that crisis impacts African people or black people in the U.S. That was a very important petition because, you know, at that point in 1946, there was an intensification in the beginning of the so-called Cold War, the struggle between the Western powers and the Eastern powers led by the Soviet Union. And of course, the major component of that Cold War was an ideological struggle, okay? So here you have this group that was submitting this petition to this newly established international organization saying that the U.S. was guilty of human rights violations in the United States. At the same time that the U.S., of course, was making arguments that there were millions of people who were denied their human rights in the Eastern Bloc. So that was one petition. That caused an international sort of reaction. But, you know, because the National Negro Congress was seen as a leftist organization, you know, they kind of dismissed that. But the very next year, 1947, the NAACP, under the leadership of W.B. Du Bois, who was in charge of their research department, they also submitted a very important petition. Now, because of the standing of NAACP, the U.S. government and Western powers couldn't just dismiss that. And that caused an international reaction. the U.S. authorities went crazy. You know, we all hear about the role of Eleanor Roosevelt being a champion of the human rights framework. We all heard that, right?
Yes.
That's partially true, but it's basically a distortion. It's an exaggeration, because while she played a role in that process, we have extensive documentation that indicated that her main objective was to make sure that whatever was produced coming out of that process was going to protect the United States of America. And so when the NAACP submitted their petition, and she was in fact on the board of directors, she hit the ceiling. In fact, she tried to do whatever she could do to try to undermine that petition. And she even threatened to resign from the board of that organization. Right after the NAACP submitted that petition to the Human Rights Commission, a communique came down from the State Department. You see, at that point, they were trying to put in place a document that would have legally binding standing, that would represent the human rights principles and framework, an international covenant, okay? That was going to have both economic, social, and rights, and cultural rights, and political rights, okay? But when that petition, the second petition was submitted, a communique came down from the State Department, and they said, basically, we're not going to support any legally binding document. So the U.S. government shifted their entire approach to human rights as a consequence of this intervention, this advocacy on the part of African Americans. And instead of supporting a legally binding document that would govern how states related to their own citizens and serve as a framework for human rights, instead the U.S. government decided they were only going to support a declaration of human rights that will be non-binding.
Teach.
Thus, we have in 1948, we have the establishment, a very important establishment, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A Universal Declaration of Human Rights that reflected some very important principles and values, but it had no legal standing, okay? And that international instrument that they were trying to develop that would reflect economic, social, and cultural rights and political and civil rights, they decided to split up. And then they put it on the shelf for many years because in order for the Truman administration to get support for just backing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they had to tell the Southern-based senators that they were not going to put any kind of real support behind anything that came out of the UN that was legally binding. Because Southern senators recognized that this was a challenge, a threat to the ongoing Southern apartheid system in the United States of America. So what we have here as a consequence of this intervention, a complete shift in U.S. strategy, U.S. approaches to human rights. And like I said, as a consequence of their feeling threatened by promoting and surfacing, raising up the ongoing racial contradictions in the U.S., they decided to basically put on the shelf this whole idea of human rights. And they did that until the early 1960s. And that, the only reason why that changed in the early 1960s was because of what? There was a shift in international power. You had the intensification of the anti-colonial struggles. So you had states who were finally able to throw off the yoke of colonialism. And when they were able to do that and to take their place as members within the United Nations, the first thing that they started to advocate for was to bring back the human rights framework and to strengthen the framework. And that became the context that Malcolm talked about. That's why he advocated that it was important for us to link up to that motion that's unfolding in the United States of America and throughout the world with this human rights movement that was developing. So that's why we embraced that. And we embraced that because we understood that we weren't going to be able to address human rights without addressing the issue of structural oppression. Okay? So that was sort of the radical thrust of the human rights framework. We understood that we could not just be concerned with human rights in the U.S. and not be concerned with the still ongoing struggles for authentic decolonization. So this became the radical thrust, if you will, of the human rights framework. And that's the framework that guides our work even up to today. So, using that approach, that there should be one standard applicable to all. That became the framework that we use when you fast forward to the 1990s. We began to advocate again on the part of developing a new human rights movement in the United States. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, we saw expanded political space to re-embrace, if you will, the human rights framework, but to give it even deeper and more radical content. We said that basically, the kind of state-centric process of establishing and developing human rights law, when you have states that came together and would establish the framework, even though you can have advocacy from citizens from below, it was still a state-centric process. We said that now that process had to be people-centered. And many of you might recall that in the 1990s we had a series of international gatherings to expand our understanding of human rights. That's where, they run the tape from Hillary Clinton's comments in Beijing. She talked about that human rights were women's rights, and women's rights, human rights. That was one of those international gatherings that were very important that took place in the 1990s. In the 2000s, what we decided, in the beginning of 2003, that we were going to bring all of this new motion that was developing in the United States, using the human rights framework, and put it into one network. And that network was called the U.S. Human Rights Network. We brought together most of the major human rights organizations, along with a number of community groups and progressive groups from across the country. We started with a base of 60 organizations, and we quickly expanded to over 300. The thrust of this work was to engage in a process of developing a people-centered human rights approach. One of which we didn't pretend that what we were doing was politically neutral. We identified the forces that are responsible for ongoing human rights violations. We identified the systems, and we said that the system that is responsible for ongoing human rights violations in the U.S. and around the world was the system of white supremacy, colonial, capitalist, patriarchy. We made that very clear. So for us, the human rights framework and the objective of our struggles was to identify and to struggle against those structural elements, those structural relationships that are responsible for the ongoing plight that we face in this country and millions of people around the world face. So we made those connections. What are some of those issues that are ongoing in the U.S.? I think that we are pretty clear about that. I mean, you have, for example, this crisis with incarceration. We have 2.1 million people who are incarcerated, with the vast majority being people of color. When you add the people on parole and probation, that balloons to 7 million people who are under some kind of control of the state. We've seen what is happening with the role of the police forces in communities across this country. This process of making war against our own citizens, if you will, within the context of an atmosphere of impunity. Impunity because here we have all of these murders that we're able to watch in the comfort of our homes. But yet we see that the federal government has only saw fit to bring charges against one of these law enforcement personnel. One. So the message was very clear, and it's still relatively clear, that one can shoot, beat, murder people of color, black people specifically, and get away with it. That is an ongoing human rights issue in this country. We have the ongoing human rights issue of thousands, tens of thousands of child offenders, young people under 18 years old, being transferred into the adult system. That's been identified on numerous occasions as a human rights violation. In fact, it violates one of the few of the human rights documents that the U.S. signed, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that denies that transference of child offenders into the adult system. But we know that happens on a systematic basis here in this country. We have this situation of young people, child offenders, once again, who have been convicted of capital murder as young as 12, who then get condemned to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That is sheer barbarism. But it is a standard practice that we have struggled against for quite some time. We've been able to make some adjustments, but that was something that was in place. And we had over 2,000 young people who were facing and experiencing that kind of draconian sentence. Can you imagine you do something at 13 and you are now condemned for your entire life? It's insane. It's madness. But that is policy here in this country. We even look at the economic and social issues that are in fact ongoing human rights issues. The fact that we have almost 1 million people who don't have any place to lay their head at the end of the day, who walk the streets without a home. You know, because over the last few decades there's been a systematic dismantling of any kind of real housing policies here in this country, except to eliminate public housing. That is an ongoing human rights issue here in this country. And we have people in this country today, even under the Affordable Care Act, who live in fear of getting sick. Because you are underinsured, you can't afford the co-payments if you have any kind of insurance, you know. But we also know too that we still have 28 million people in this country without any kind of coverage. That's backward. You raise your hand, I'm in the same boat. I have no coverage. That's backward. Because many of us can't even afford, you know, the Affordable Care Act. You know, it's beyond our means. That's crazy. We have a situation here with education, where across this country, they are closing schools, primarily in black and brown neighborhoods, but also in rural neighborhoods, as part of the austerity policies that no one talks about. So we don't talk about austerity here in this country. And we don't talk about austerity resulting in ongoing human rights violations. When you close schools, cut back on public services, where people starve because they don't have access to food, where elders are basically left by themselves because those services have been cut back. These are all violations. The fact that we still have corporations that are placing these polluting plants in our communities, destroying the water and the air, where we have communities like African Americans who have the highest percentages of asthma of any population in this society. These are ongoing violations. The fact that we have a situation where people die prematurely because they don't have health care, because they are exposed to all of these unfair and backward and dangerous kinds of practices in their communities. This is undignified, and these are ongoing human rights violations, and they have to be defined as such. So this is the kind of reframing that we say we have to make here in this country. And this is the kind of redefining we have to also engage in. That we, struggle for some incremental changes, but if you make an assessment that there are ongoing human rights issues here in this country, and you further make the assessment that those ongoing human rights issues is a result of how society is organized, that is the structures and the institutions that create these ongoing human rights issues, then what is the logical conclusion?
Change the system.
That the only way we're going to ultimately address these ongoing human rights violations, we've got to transform this system totally. So this people-centered approach to human rights that names the enemy, that identifies the structures, this is the radical approach we have to embrace. This is the structural analysis that we have to recenter in order for us to really address the issues that really are impacting our people. And anything short of that is not really being honest. Okay? So these are the issues that we attempt to tackle and embrace within the Stein Baraka campaign. We say that not only are there ongoing human rights issues, we say that these issues that are ongoing can only be redefined as issues that have to be seen as human rights. That is to say that if we have policies, if we have governmental programs that are really committed to protecting and fulfilling human rights, then we would recognize and center that healthcare should be a human right.
Yes, sir.
That housing should be a human right.
Yes.
That education should be a human right.
Yes.
And that any government that calls itself democratic has to be committed to upholding and fulfilling those fundamental human rights. So in this campaign that we are attempting to run, and I say attempting because it's a struggle, that not only do we have an approach that says that we have to recenter human rights, that we have to redefine human rights, that we have to struggle with people so people understand that they in fact do have human rights. We have to struggle to have that message being brought to the people because we are being blocked at every turn.
Yes.
They don't want us to have exposure to the American people.
Go ahead.
They are, in fact, involved in a whiteout. We don't get a chance to penetrate the corporate media.
Go ahead.
We don't get a chance to talk about what our policies are and how we propose to address some of these issues. We don't get a chance to talk about the fact that you can't have real dignity in this country if you don't even have a way to make sure you can survive. So they know, as we understand, that to tell the American people that we should have a system and a government that reflects our interests, and that we should have universal basic income, that is everybody in this society has guaranteed income. They don't want people to have that, they know that. They don't want people to even consider that possibility. So we are disconnected. We are blocked from those messages. So, the kinds of issues that we want to address, the ongoing issues we see in this country, the grinding poverty, the obscene income and wealth inequality that Bernie Sanders and other folks talked about, we want to address those issues in a serious way. But the way in which we understand they have to be addressed is that it's not just about electing us, which would be a significant step forward, no question about that. But we recognize that we're not going to be able to bring about the kinds of transformations that we talked about, the kind of structural change that we need to achieve without a powerful people's movement.
Yeah.
So this campaign is about building that movement. It's not just about going and voting on November the 8th, which is very, very important. No question about that. But it's about people understanding that they, in fact, have power and that we help to organize that power. This campaign is about linking up the Green Party as an instrument for radical change with the ongoing social movements in this country.
That's right.
Those social movements that believe that we should contest the state and that the electoral space is a space in which we could enter into and, in fact, contest the state. We want to have that instrument they can use to, in fact, do that. That's why we have to develop this apparatus. So this campaign is about moving across this country and trying to get our message to the American people. But it's also about developing this apparatus. Because we recognize that we are in a protracted struggle. That we're not going to be able to defeat our enemies just by shouting at them or even temporary mobilizations. That we have to build these alternative, popular, independent political structures.
That's right.
So this is our task and our responsibility. This is what we're trying to do across this country. And that's why we are so happy when we get a chance to get on these campuses, because, you know, the force that's going to take this struggle forward are, in fact, young people.
That's right.
They really are. I had a chance this morning. We went to Renaissance High School, and we talked to, it must have been, I don't know, hundreds of students.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
When did you do that?
this morning.
Oh, really?
This morning,
Oh, that's
yes.
fantastic.
Yeah, so we are really inspired by that. We love to be on these campuses. We understand our task to try to win more and more people over to an understanding that we, in fact, do have the power to transform ourselves and to transform our conditions. This is what we have to do. One quick last comment about what we're up against in terms of ongoing human rights violations. Now, we talk a lot about what is happening here in the U.S. But what we haven't talked about, and we have to talk about, and hopefully we can talk about it in the Q&A sessions, is the fact that many people, millions of people around the world are suffering systematic human rights violations. And they are suffering because of the policies and the practices of this government. So while people can be upset, and rightly so, coming out of the attacks of 9/11, it is fundamentally unfair and morally unjustifiable and morally indefensible for anybody to be able to defend the fact that as a consequence of the retaliation from the U.S. state, over 2 million people in the Middle East have lost their lives.
Wow.
Yeah.
You can't defend that.
The United States has killed more people than any other country in the whole world.
Yes, we have. So when we talk about human rights, we can't just have a U.S.-centric perspective. One of the things that we believe defines our campaign from the other campaigns is the fact that not only do we feel we have some progressive ideals about the economy and about domestic policies, but that we are committed to peace. We're committed to anti-intervention. We're committed to anti-imperialism.
Yes.
And I think that's an important distinction. So my friends, brothers and sisters, when we talk about human rights, we have a holistic perspective. When we talk about social change, we're not just talking about social change here in the U.S. When we talk about defining and struggling against an enemy, we have to understand that we are connected up with struggling and oppressed people around the world. This is a national, but also an international movement. And we struggle knowing that we are on the right side of history. And while our numbers may be small today, we can see around the bend. We know, and I like that term you said, that the Green Party is not an alternative, it's an imperative. This is the only instrument we have right now to challenge corporate power. And we have to understand that we have the power and, in fact, the responsibility to, in fact, do that. So, my friends, thank you for giving me these few moments. Let's have some more conversation. And thank you again for coming out this afternoon.